When you hear the term witches, what comes to mind? Is it the fantastical depiction of them in cinema? Is it a spooky folktale? Or perhaps is it the brutal witch hunts that have marked the course of all human history? Today, if I hear someone say they are a witch, I perhaps think they're a very spiritual person. Perhaps they are very naturistic and believe in the ability of energy changing your soul and spirit, but never does it cross my mind that they are a mistress of Satan. Hi guys, and welcome to Makeup and History. I'm your host and storyteller, Anna. Hi, how are you today? It has been far too long since I've sat down and filmed one of these, so I'm excited. Today we're going to dive into one of the most brutal witch hunts in all of human history. Are you ready? Before we get started, please give this video a thumbs up. I'd really appreciate it, and also subscribe to my channel. It helps my tiny little channel out so much. It helps me keep creating these videos for you, and also you can stay tuned for more episodes in this series. Now let's dive into it, shall we? Within the 1600s, about the 1640s, there was the King Charles of England had almost outlawed witch hunting. He had believed that there wasn't quite enough evidence to prove that so many of these women in his country were actually witches, and he believed that the means in which people got witches to confess was actually torture. And as anyone would know, anyone who is under some form of torture will probably say anything at some point. People break. So for a while, witch hunts had basically been banned, and there was, in a span of about 50 years, only about 2 women in the entire country of England had been charged with witchcraft. Well, that was all about to change in the year 1645. And it began in a small town off the river of Essex. You see, the wife of a tailor had fallen gravely ill. And at the time, unfortunately, germ theory and common flu was not really something people understood like you and I today. They didn't understand how someone who had seemingly been healthy the week before could all of a sudden get sick. So during a council meeting of the town, this tailor by the name of John came up to the council, and he was determined to get justice for his wife. You see, she had fallen sick with a fever, nausea, and dizziness. Now to you and I today, that might sound like a case of the flu. But again, they didn't understand how germs could be passed between one person and another at this time. And so the tailor John goes up to the council and he says, "My wife has fallen gravely ill, and I need to save her." And he blamed this sickness on witchcraft. He claimed she had been bewitched by another woman in the town named Elizabeth Clark, that she had cursed her and caused his wife to fall gravely ill, and the only way to save his wife would be to prosecute the witch. You see, the witch he blamed, the witch, and I use witch in air quotes for the duration of this video. Now you see, Elizabeth Clark was about an 80-year-old woman. She was 80 years old. Her husband had passed, so she was a widower. She lived on the edge of town. She had one foot, and well, she wasn't very liked. She was a rude woman who would just curse at people and just, well, she was ornery and not a nice woman. And I mean, can you blame her? I mean, she's 80, she has one leg, lost her husband, and that sounds like a pretty rough life. Like, I would be angry too. So many people in the town believed she was a witch, because there's no other explanation for people just being genuinely just irritated people. So he blamed Elizabeth Clark. Now, just claiming she was a witch was not enough, because believe it or not, even at this time, you still needed proof, which is great, right? Evidence. Well, you see, another man claimed he had evidence that Elizabeth Clark was a witch. Now, was this evidence really truly evidence? Well, he had eyewitness statements from other people in the town who claimed to have seen her do weird things, you know. She didn't go to church enough, you know, that's a sign of a witch. She doesn't go to church enough. She curses at people. She's genuinely angry. She keeps to herself. So all these eyewitness statements were enough to give proof. Now, the man who had these eyewitness statements was a man by the name of Stern, and he claimed he could get her to confess and claim that she was a witch so that they could prosecute her. So the people in charge of the council of the town was like, okay, sure. They gave him a permit, and this permit was basically enough to say, you could hunt down this witch. You can gather evidence and send her to trial, but he must have more evidence than just eyewitness statements. Really, the only way to get a witch to trial at this point was they needed a confession. But you see, the man named Stern wasn't going to be the person to drive this. You see, a man in the council meeting by the name of Matthew Hopkins was the son of a priest, and he was a very, very religious man. And he grew up believing that, well, it wasn't enough to just believe in God and to follow the laws of God, but to implicate them and to strip the world of those who, well, weren't godly enough. You know, he had to cleanse the earth for the sake of God, in order to be a good son of God. That's what Matthew Hopkins believed. And so when this meeting adjourned, Matthew Hopkins went up to Stern and offered his services in order to get Elizabeth Clark convicted of witchcraft. Now, you see, at this time, thankfully, torture was banned, okay? You couldn't use torture to get people to confess because thankfully people realized torture really doesn't work, because anyone who is being tortured, they're likely to break at some point. You're either killed from the torture goes too far and you die either way, or you break and confess under torture because it's so bad that you just want to die anyway. Like, you don't care anymore. So torture is not effective, and at this time, thankfully, they've realized this. Now, that doesn't mean they can't go about using nefarious means. So Stern and Hopkins get the help of about 3 women in the town, and they go to Elizabeth Clark's house, and because, well, it's okay for women to hit other women, what they did is they grabbed her from her home, beat her, stripped her, cut her hair off, and you're like, why? Well, they were looking for something called the Devil's Mark. Now, this was a sign to people of the time that you had relations with the devil, if you know what I'm saying. And the devil would kiss you somewhere on your body and leave his mark, and that would give you, like, your powers. So they were looking for a mark. Literally any type of mark. So if you were born with a birthmark, you're screwed. If you have any mole on your body, you're screwed. If you have a freckle, you're screwed. Basically, if you have any sort of marking on your body, they could point it out as the devil's mark. Like, I have a little mole on my face right here. I would have been convicted of a witch. Easily. And of course, this is an 80-year-old woman. Okay, she's lived a long life. You don't think her skin has been marked with age? There's no way an 80-year-old woman has not a singular mark on her body, even a scar of some kind, could be used. And well, after they beat her, tied her up, cut off all her hair, they found one at the base of her neck, a tiny little freckle, but it was enough to convince them. So they needed a confession. And how do they get someone to confess without torture? Well, this is finally when Stern and Hopkins show up, and they decide to use the method of sleep deprivation. Now, this wasn't considered torture yet. We know today you can't use sleep deprivation as a way of interrogation, because again, you know, sleep deprivation, your brain starts not working right after a while. You know, if you don't get enough sleep, you can start hallucinating, you can start, you know, you can go crazy, and you'll say anything, okay? It's painful. It is a form of torture. Of course, they didn't see it as this at this point. So Elizabeth Clark was forced to stay awake for over 3 days, completely starved, no water, and every time she almost fell asleep, she was slapped to keep awake. And well, this was a strong old woman, but eventually everyone breaks. And at about day 3, she finally just confessed. She was like, yeah, sure, I'm a witch, whatever. But you see, Elizabeth Clark wasn't going to go down alone. She decided she was going to claim she was part of a coven, right? That there were other witches in town. There were many witches in town, actually, and she began to name quite a few women in the town. So not only did she get imprisoned, but about 30 other women also from that town, just on the claims that Elizabeth claimed they were also witches, they too were sentenced to prison. Within 2 months of Elizabeth's confession, about 30 women were rounded up and put in prison, waiting trial. Now, 4 of these women died in prison due to sicknesses, probably tuberculosis. And at the trial, nearly 15 women out of all of these were convicted of witchcraft. And for the longest time, there hadn't really been any witches convicted, and now 15 of them were convicted and condemned to hang in the same day, including Elizabeth Clark herself. Now, this was the biggest witch trial England had ever seen. Usually, witch trials had maybe 1, 2, 3 at most women on trial at a time. This was 15 women in one day. And for every witch that Hopkins had managed to get to confess and, well, condemned to hang, well, he got paid for it, you see. He had just convicted 15 women in one go. That was the biggest trial at that time, okay? He had just made himself his own career, okay? He was now a witch hunter, and he was supposedly very good at it. Now, you see, he only had a license to hunt witches in his own town, right? The council of their town gave him permission. No other town gave him permission to hunt witches. But he had just condemned 15 in one go, okay? He was feeling quite confident. So when a nearby town wanted to have their priest, yes, you heard that right, their own priest, their clergyman, the man who taught sermons, okay, condemned for witchcraft, well, Matthew decided, this is perfect for me. I can do this. This was a man of the cloth, of the faith, okay? And people just didn't like him. They're like, yeah, we don't like him. He's kind of old, a bit ornery. People just didn't like him, okay? And, well, at the time, that was enough to, start prosecuting people for witchcraft. If you didn't like someone, you could just be like, I kind of want them hanged, You want them dead. So Matthew went to this town, and he was like, okay, I just convicted 15 witches. All right, I can get a clergyman to confess, right? That should be easy. So this poor man, the Vicar John, again, another 80-year-old man, he grabs him and decides to do the exact same thing he did with Elizabeth Clark and all the other witches he got to confess. Well, he was going to do sleep deprivation again. Only this time it was a lot more brutal. You see, he decided he was going to force the Vicar John to run. He had to walk and run constantly for days at a time. He couldn't sit down, he couldn't stop, and if he did collapse, he was dragged about by Matthew Hopkins' little henchman. This was a man of God. This was a priest. So he needed a confession, and he needed one that he was a witch. But you see, this old man, this man of God, he was not going to confess, okay? He had taken an oath to be a man of God. He honestly, he wasn't a witch. He was just someone people didn't like, okay? Imagine nowadays if you just hated your neighbor enough and you could be like, they're a witch, hang them, I'm done with them, don't want to live next to them anymore. You know, you'd be seen today as ridiculous, okay? You'd be like, what's wrong with you? Just, if you hate your neighbors that much, move. Well, people didn't just move out of their villages at this time, you know, they lived and died in the exact same place. So sleep deprivation wasn't working, and Hopkins had he had a reputation to maintain. He couldn't just have condemned 15 witches in once and not get one single man to break. Well, you see, Hopkins had a massive ego, and he decided that his crusade to cleanse the land of witches, and he was anointed by God to do this, was higher than the law. So what did he do? Well, he converted to torture. Yes, he decided to torture people. Now, this was incredibly illegal. Like I've said, super illegal, okay? So what does he do? Well, the poor Vicar John, he decides to do, and you might be familiar with this if you know anything about witch trials, he decided to do a technique called swimming the witch, right? And this is where you kind of threw witches tied and bound into a lake, a river, right? And if they floated, they were a witch, right? And if they sunk and drowned, well, they were innocent. Now, oftentimes, a lot of times when people sunk to the bottom, you know, people didn't really want to, oh, they sunk, they're obviously not a witch. Someone should probably go in and pull them out. People really didn't do that, and so oftentimes you were dead either way. You either drowned or you floated, they pulled you out and hung you. Well, you see, after constantly being thrown into a river to see whether he sunk or drowned, and we think Matthew did this multiple times, right? You gotta make sure you're right? You gotta make sure. So he was bound, tied, and thrown into a river, into a freezing cold river to drown, and then pulled out and then nearly drowned, and then pulled out and then nearly drowned. This was literally torture. And so finally, I mean, how much can one person take? I would have just been like, just kill me. I don't care. Just, I'm a witch, whatever. And so eventually, after all this, well, the vicar says, fine, I'm a witch, kill me. But you see, he never actually admits to making a pact with the devil. He was still a man of God after all. But he claims he threw curses, whatever. It was enough. It was enough to condemn him to hang. He did. He was condemned to death. He was condemned to hang. And what's really funny, this man, I admire this man, okay? I get people didn't like him, that he was like an ornery old man, but he really stuck to his convictions, right? He was a man of God after all, right? And he was not going to break that pact he made with God. And he even performed his own funeral service before he was hung. Like, imagine performing your own funeral service knowing you're about to die in like 20 minutes. I could never. So he was condemned to hang, and in that same town, you know, he had managed to get a bunch of other witches. People the townsfolk didn't like, people the townsfolk wanted to point fingers at. Yep, he got some more, just because people didn't like them. So Matthew Hopkins had gotten his confession, and he had gotten it through torture. And while torture works, and he was like, well, we're not going to stop this, he traveled all across England, right? He traveled to every tiny little town he could. Literally, within one summer, 90 people, majority of them either old women or single women who didn't have husbands, were hung. In one summer, this man had put nearly, well, actually it's predicted that he had over 100 people hanged. And remember, with each one, he came with a fee. He was pricey. If you wanted to get rid of witches, well, you had to pay the price. And well, you see, here's the problem. Witches are very, very expensive to kill. Killing people, executing people, it's expensive, okay? Like, you have to pay for the gallows to be set up, you have to pay someone to hang the rope, you have to pay a judge to do the trial, and then you have to pay the witch hunter, Hopkins. He charged a heavy fee, okay? These small towns did not make a lot of money. They really didn't. And so he was charging nearly, well, a large portion of their entire annual income. These entire towns were losing all their money to killing the neighbors they didn't like. Like, do you really want to spend all the money you make in 1 year just because you hate your neighbor? I mean, think about it. Don't you have better things to do with that money? And well, even at this time, witches were hated. Like, witches were very real to people. At this time, they did believe that a singular person could make a pact with the devil and all of a sudden they can curse everyone, they can cause famine, drought, all this stuff. Like, this was very real to them. People genuinely believed this. But what people like more than killing witches was their own money. And I don't blame them. Like, why would I spend money on people I didn't like just to see them die? I mean, I don't want to see anyone dead, but at this time, people really didn't care. Like, they were like, yeah, it was entertainment, unfortunately. But what people cared about more was their own money, and this was going to cause a problem for Matthew Hopkins. You see, people were starting to realize just how much money he was costing them. And what do towns do when they need to make up funds and money? What do? Well, they tax their people, right? They tax them. And I don't know if anyone knows anything about the history of the world, but people don't respond very well to taxing, to getting taxed higher and higher and increasing taxes. People don't like it because it's less money for themselves, right? You know, throughout history, like, we've seen this is nothing new, okay? And so towns that he hadn't gone to were starting to hear words from other towns, you know, in the area. They were like, hey, he cost you a pretty penny. Are you willing to give up all this money for him? And so in the towns he was planning on going to, people started not wanting to hang anyone anymore. And there was another priest. A priest by the name of Gall. Now, Matthew Hopkins was a very powerful and wealthy man at this point, much more powerful and wealthy than the son of a humble priest really should be. And he was making a lot of money. He was very powerful. Everyone knew his name. Small towns knew his names. And for a while, small towns, like, begged him to come to their town. But again, people were starting to realize how pricey he was. And so, like I was saying, there was a priest by the name of Gall, G-A-L-E. What a beautiful name. Well, that was his last name, actually. But he very, very, very publicly opposed the idea of hunting witches. He really didn't like it, and he really didn't like Hopkins. He saw Hopkins as, well, a fraud, right? People really believed in Hopkins. He got results, you know? He hung over 100 quote-unquote witches. But Gall didn't like this, and so Gall started doing sermons, very, very public sermons to the people of his town. One, because he was trying to convince them, why are you spending all your money to hang the neighbors you hate? Like, come on. Like, really? You're gonna spend all your money on someone else? And it worked. People really didn't like this, and he also talked about Matthew Hopkins' methods. Now, it wasn't widely known, but it was kind of speculated that Matthew had to have been using torture, right? And while these small towns really couldn't do much about it, because even though it was illegal, you know, where are the lawmen to stop him? You really think they're in small towns? No, they're in big towns, you know, schmoozing up with noblemen. Like, the lawmen aren't out in the tiny little towns, you know, policing stuff. And so these small towns really didn't care that he was torturing people, nor did they really realize he was doing it. They just saw results and they liked it. So Gall publicly, very, very publicly opposed Matthew. And he even published some pamphlets, right? And he was like, you know, he's using torture, he's a fraud, he's costing the townspeople way too much money. And of course, Matthew didn't take this lightly, right? He decided he was going to also, again, publicly threaten this priest. He was like, I put one priest to death already. You don't think I'll do it again? Like, he's basically threatening to have him killed for witchcraft, like, just because he spoke out against him. Oh, Matthew. This was not a smart move on Matthew's part. He really shouldn't have said anything. Because you see, Gaul didn't care. He was like, come at me. My townspeople love me. They're not going to have me killed off. You know, they know the truth, yada, yada, yada. And all that, you know, all that stuff. And he decided to, like, publish, like, a book on Matthew. And about witch hunting and how Matthew was a fraud and all this stuff. And basically exposing Matthew. Now, this caught the attention of some lawmen in the north, right? People with influence, people with power. And they were kind of angry. They were like, this dude's torturing people? But torture is outlawed. He knows this. Like, he can't do this. He's making a mockery of royal decree and all this stuff, you know. He was... Where do laws come from? Well, they usually come from, you know, the person in power. The kings, the noblemen, and he was going against them. And he was the son of a lowly priest. Who was he to be doing this? Right? So they decided they were going to publish a book themselves, right? And they did. They published a book, and it went... I don't want to use the word viral, because how viral can something go in the 1600s? But people all of a sudden started to take notice of Matthew Hopkins. Now, he was really powerful and well known as, like, the witch hunter, you know? He was the witch hunter. But people were starting to hear the bad parts of Matthew Hopkins. He wasn't just killing witches for the purpose of helping England, you know, to better appease God by getting rid of all the witches, right? He was basically... He was doing it for his own satisfaction, and what once was supposedly supposed to be a way of doing godly deeds, whatever you want to call them. He was just doing this for his own purpose. He was making a ton of money. He was basically causing all these small towns to go completely broke. And he was doing it by torture. Which, again, like I said, like 1,000 times, super illegal. Now, Matthew could have genuinely quit while he was ahead. Because even though no other towns were allowing him to work and, well, hunt witches in their town anymore due to some accusations against him and his insanely high prices, he still was very wealthy. He had a lot of money. He had gotten a lot of money. And in his 2-year career of being a witch hunter, he had sent nearly 200 people to their death, right? Nearly 200. That was more witches that had been convicted in the past 200 years in England, and he did it in 2, right? Granted, he tortured them until they eventually confessed to whatever he thought they did, even if they were innocent, which, not a great tactic, but it worked. He could have just quit while he was ahead, but of course, Matthew had an ego. He thought he was above the law. He was God's worker. He was doing this all in the name of God. But Matthew, oh Matthew. He decided, you know, these men had claims against him, right? You know, they had claimed he was using torture very publicly. People were starting to see it. And Matthew could have just retired. Let it go. Probably nothing would have happened, right? Wrong. Matthew decided, being the showman that he is, he was going to publish their accusations against him and, besides them, write his defense for them. And in this, he actually... Dude literally confesses that he tortured people. He literally does. He confesses it, but he uses, like, the excuse that an old king, not the king of England at the time, but an old king would have allowed it. You can't just be quoting dead kings, honey. Who's in charge right now? Who's making the laws? Not the dead king, I'll tell you that. So he literally confesses to torture, saying that King James, the king prior to King Charles, who was the king at the time, would have allowed it, would have thought it was perfectly fine. Matthew, you dumb. This backfired. This publication, it really did. Because he confessed to things and people were pissed. They were angry. They did not want his service. He was basically like blacklisted from the witch hunting business, right? No one could ever trust him again. Fate is funny. Would he have been charged with, well, quite a few crimes with torture? Dude probably would have been hanged himself, tried and hanged. Unfortunately, fate was really funny. 2 years after his career in 1647, when he was only in his mid-20s, dude was young, and he had already managed to kill literally like 200 women. Well, he dies. He contracted tuberculosis, and he dies. We never quite see what could have become of this witch hunter, but he definitely, in those 2 years, left behind quite the legacy. Well, he killed over 200 people. But in the end, just before he died and even after he died, well, his legacy was tainted. People didn't think he did good anymore. Right, they saw him as a fraud, someone who just wanted to make money and who went after easy targets. He went after a lot of old women and a lot of single women. These were people who were, you know, a strain on village resources because they didn't have husbands to make money because women couldn't make money, you know. And so it was just an easy excuse to get rid of these people, these undesirables. Even though he was known as the witch hunter, you know, the Witchhunter General, that was his title, and he had managed to kill over 200 people, he didn't leave the legacy behind that he really wanted, right? He wanted to be this almighty, powerful, sent by God to cleanse the land. And whenever anyone says they want to cleanse a population, that's not a good sign. That's not a good sign. That is the story of the most brutal, deadly witch hunt in all of England history. Perhaps in all of human history, really. Like 200 people in 2 years? That was more than had ever been seen at that time. That was just massive, and he did it all himself. Oh, those poor women he killed. I feel so bad for them. My gosh, it's heartbreaking. But thankfully nowadays, thankfully we live in a time where you're not gonna be, you know, hung and killed on the accusation of witchcraft. What a world to live in. I would not have wanted to live in that time period. You know what I'm saying? That concludes our video. I really hope you liked this story. It's quite interesting. The history of witches and witch hunts just absolutely fascinate me. How people could literally believe these things, it's beyond me, but that was the time they lived in. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this story. Please give it a thumbs up, I'd really appreciate it. And also subscribe to stay tuned. I got quite a few more stories coming your way, and I hope you enjoyed it. Anyway, I hope you have a wonderful day.